Starmer is not fantastic at politics. He's not a political creature.
I remember one of the issues was who would actually fly people to Rwanda. And I was told that the RAF, or the military, were refusing. Hello and welcome to the Quite Right Question and Answers podcast. My name is Michael Gove. I'm the editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer.
And this week, we'll be asking, would the Tories have possibly done better at the last general election if they delivered on their Rwanda promises? We'll be considering why it is that even with a majority of 174, Labour backbenchers are so querulous and Keir Starmer seems to back down so often. And we'll be asking whether or not the United Nations is good for anything.
First question is from Joanne Jarrett. The Labour government was elected on a majority of 174. So why does it cave into relatively small backbench rebellions? Surely they should only be worried when it looks like they can't pass legislation.
Well, I do sympathise with Joanne's view. A majority of 174 should be, if not the result of an overwhelming mandate at the ballot box, certainly an opportunity in the House of Commons to push through momentous or significant legislation. I think it's the case that the rebellions that you see, the people that you see leading them, may look like a relatively small group, but actually the roots of it go deeper. So the first thing is that if the government had gone ahead with its plans for welfare, I think that there would have been an accumulating number of people who would have been either in opposition or discombobulated. The other thing also is that there will be people who will support the government, but if they think it's either unpopular or there's a prospect of U-turn, then you're squandering your capital with them to force them to support something that they know is going to make their constituents uncomfortable.
Yes, I think that's right. And actually some of these rebellions, as you say, there are visible figureheads, but there's more people that are keeping quiet but will turn. So that's important. I think some of these rebellions are actually precisely because the government fears that they won't be able to pass legislation. They kind of preemptively shelve things that seem unwinnable. And there's kind of two other things going on here. There's this massive majority, but also the size of the majority actually means that from the perspective of the Whip's office and Number 10, there's actually comparatively few rewards that they can offer. There's not much that they can dole out in the way of patronage, rewards that they can give to backbenchers. And also, I think the shallowness of many of the majorities is worth observing. You know, some of them have actually majorities of under 1,000. So they are hypersensitive to anything that they think will be unpopular. So there's a lot of them. Some of them are quite fidgety and looking at the polling data and stuff. They're frightened. And because they haven't really been given anything from Number 10, because they can only reward so many people, I mean, it's always worth keeping an eye on how many people have been made like the special envoy to this very far away country. Like this is what passes for patronage in this kind of system. But it makes them quite twitchy and liable to change. Also, I do think it reflects something about the way that Starmer is not fantastic at politics, which we've spoken about in other podcasts. He's not a political creature. One thing that he did pretty quickly was appointing his good friend Lord Hermer to be Attorney General. Now, this peeved Emily Thornberry, who'd been in line for that job. And now as chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, she's a real thorn in the government's side. That's just a microcosm of it. It's actually not dissimilar, I think, to Boris Johnson, who had, again, an ostensibly large majority, but not a really strong loyalty base within his own party. Someone like Angela Rayner commands a much greater fervour and loyalty because she is a political creature. She's a creature of the unions, whereas Starmer came to politics relatively recently.
I think all of those points apply. When you've got people with relatively small majorities, like there's a chap called Neil Duncan Jordan, who I think is the MP for Poole, who I think surprised himself when he won. And also there's a chap called Chris Hinchliffe, who represents a home county seat, Terry Jeremy, a Labour MP who represents Liz Truss's seat. They, I think, entirely rationally calculate that this is probably their only term.
Yes.
Therefore, they're not going to bow the knee in order to secure preferment in a big job because, A, it's with a parliamentary party, as you quite rightly point out, as big as this, extremely unlikely. And B, they're, by definition, if you're selected as the Labour candidate in Poole, you're not doing it because you're a careerist. You're doing it because you're an idealist, and therefore, once you're elected, there's every chance that you might put your attachment to your ideals and to the small band of committed socialists in the Poole constituency Labour Party ahead of what Keir Starmer wants.
So they're actually more likely to be kind of, I guess, machine-y politicians are more likely to end up in a safer seat.
Yes.
So you get these independent-minded people who never expected to win, and probably number 10 didn't expect to win either. So they were like, oh, who cares about Poole, let's say, or some rural seat that they haven't won since 1930s,
Yes.
the 1930s or something. Who cares? And then you end up with a bit of a turncoat type.
Precisely. And you're right that over time governments have expanded the range of jobs that you can dangle, which, while not being part of the government, offer some compensation for the grind of parliamentary life. So being, as you say, a trade envoy for Suriname or wherever does mean that you can travel at the taxpayer's expense to Suriname, stay in the Suriname Embassy High Commission or wherever it is, and enjoy delightful accommodation with the Surinamese business elite. It appeals to someone. So that is a means of controlling people, because if you vote consistently against the government, you're stripped of your trade envoyship. So there is that effort to control. But again, this is a temporary job. If you're a Labour MP and you think, I might be out of a Commons seat in a few years' time, 3 years, 8 years, the prospect of employment thereafter is not, I mean, it depends, but not great. But one warm and comforting resort for Labour MPs, ex-Labour MPs, is the wonderful world of NGOs. And if you've been the sort of person who has voted for cruel planning measures that are harmful to cuddly bats and lovely...
gold-crested newts.
Exactly. Then the prospect of the relevant NGO taking you to its bosom diminishes. Whereas if you've been the sturdy supporter of popular and cuddly causes, then NGO world will welcome you. And again, I don't want to appear too cynical, but if Labour MPs demonstrate, for example, that they hate the international development cuts, and that they are striving every day to restore the international development budget, then that is not a bad thing in the eyes of Oxfam, CAFOD, or others. So I don't want to be unduly cynical, but the incentives to support the government at every point for people who are on thin majorities are not there.
No, and in some cases, I think rebelling is probably a very rational decision. I mean, I'm actually not sure if Marcus Campbell-Savers, who's the MP in Penrith, he rebelled on the family farms tax. He didn't just abstain, but he voted against it. I think he was the only Labour MP to do so. Yes. I don't know if he's had the whip restored yet. Do you? I'm not sure.
I don't know. No. But it was withdrawn.
It was withdrawn. And
I think two things. Well, but because I sort of agree with the position, because I think the family farm tax is ridiculous, or was ridiculous, as it was introduced. I sympathise with him, so I agree with him. But I actually think in his case, I don't know him well, but I think he was genuinely angered on behalf of his constituents.
I don't think that he did it for a careerist reason. I think he's got, this was not in the manifesto, and they made particular assurances. Starmer addresses the NFU conference in 2023, and he kind of looks them in the eye and speaks about the pain of losing a farm, and it's not in the manifesto. They said they wouldn't do it, and they did. So I think there's an element of like real honour to what he's doing. I also think that because he put his head above the parapet and was the only MP, other MPs abstained, but he was the only one to vote against. There are a lot of people in the constituency that will admire him for that and may vote for him. So I think in some cases it's a very rational decision.
It also means that because this was an area where they subsequently U-turned, he should have the whip restored if he hasn't already. But also there'll be other Labour MPs that bit their lips and either abstained or voted with the government who'll be thinking, well, why did I do that? Why did I defend a position that's now been retreated from? And one of the things that becomes infectious is not just the habit of rebellion, but also a sense that if the government has U-turn after U-turn after U-turn, that if you seek to defend it, that you're in effect in the position of a First World War soldier volunteering to go over the top at the beginning of a doomed offensive, and it's far, far better to avoid that grim fate. Our next question comes from Joel Davidson, and Joel asks, Do you agree that the Conservatives would have saved 200 seats at the last general election if they'd sent one plane to Rwanda before calling the election? Or were they, the Conservatives, actually never really serious about the plan at all?
I don't think that they were not serious about the plan. They spoke about it constantly, expended considerable money and political capital, and I think sincerely tried to make it work. But the obstacles in its way were too great, and they think they maybe oversold what Rwanda could do. They talked of it as the solution, but it's a multifaceted problem, and there are probably numerous different things that you need to do. So I think they kind of majored a bit too heavily on that, and then it made a rod for their own back. Had they sent a plane at the last general election, would that have changed things? I'm not so sure. I mean, I think it might have been a bit like maybe Rishi Sunak leaving the D-Day commemorations early. There's probably a small number of seats that might have been saved, probably a fairly trivial number in the grand scheme of things. But I honestly don't think that the last election was primarily fought on sort of for stuff. I think people were primarily voting against stuff. And therefore, it was a case of, holding your nose and voting for the least bad option. There's no real affection or optimism anywhere in politics at the moment. But I think, I would say the bigger culprits are probably the hangover from the mini budget, the various cock-ups around the pandemic, the hypocrisy allegations, the allegations about the dodgy contracts. I think these things were probably far greater. It was kind of death by a thousand cuts.
I think that had there been success in getting a plane to go to Rwanda, had it been the case that the government had demonstrated that they were in control of the agenda on migration, it would undoubtedly have helped. It might have blunted in particular the leakage of votes to reform in some seats. But the overwhelming thing is that it would have perhaps stemmed the tide, but it couldn't have turned it, because there were so many things that the electorate were exasperated by that unless there'd been a long and sustained record of not contrition, but certainly of purposeful delivery in the final 2 years, which sought to address all of the problems that had been beforehand, then, without that, and I think it would have been near impossible actually to deliver that, then I think that the fate of the Conservatives was sealed. So the failure to deliver on Rwanda, of course, was a key reason prompting Robert Jenrick to resign, because he argued that Rishi and the rest of the government were insufficiently determined to break through the barriers. So the point of Joel's question, I think, has a continuing resonance. So whatever might have happened at the election, it gave a justification for Rob to resign. It became the focus of his concerns and disappointment. And it lingers on, I think, as a stick with which reform can beat the Conservatives on the basis that they can say, look, you were never really serious, or if you were incapable of delivery.
What is the solution? I mean, is the problem that we basically signed up to various pieces of legislation that in practice make it very difficult to deport anyone? I mean, without the going back to first principles and maybe rethinking even participating in the UN refugee code, is it just that it's all going to be tinkering around the edges until you get to the deep causes?
Yes. I think part of the problem is that there are so many impediments to swift executive action. I remember, I think I may have mentioned this to you before, that one of the issues was who would actually fly people to Rwanda. Because I remember asking in a cabinet committee meeting why it was that there was a worry about which commercial airline would do it, and the fact that commercial airlines were worried themselves that to enact the flights would be reputationally harmful. And I said, why don't we just use RAF planes? And I was told that the RAF, or the military, were refusing to have their planes used for Rwanda because it wasn't appropriate use of those assets. And I thought, firstly, why doesn't the Prime Minister just say to, whoever in the RAF or in the military, look, I'm terribly sorry. They're not your personal planes. They are at the government's disposal. But it was just an example of the way in which there were hidden internal bureaucratic barriers, as well as the external things like the various UN conventions and our membership of the ECHR. So in that sense, it requires both a painstaking dismantling of the legal ties that bind Gulliver, but it also requires an attitudinal change within government.
Were they objecting on the basis of, we don't think it's our moral responsibility to be dealing with this? Or was it a case of like, we were already undersupplied, underfunded, and those planes would be better used in defending our country? The
military have a generally, I think, sensible view, which is everyone comes to us because we're hyper-capable. So when there is
Nightingale Hospital.
Yeah, exactly. When there's a need for a Nightingale Hospital, when there's a flood.
Crowd control.
Everyone says, military assistance for the civil power. It's our job to kill the king's enemies, or at the very least deter them, and we are not maids of all work. So,
they have a point.
They do have a very good point. But that is sometimes deployed as a way of avoiding risk or controversy or too much trouble. And therefore, the art of political leadership is knowing when to respect that argument and then knowing when to say sorry. And I remember in a different area, I had arguments with the Deputy National Security Advisor and the Ministry of Defence over fisheries protection. And I argued that one of the things that we needed to do was to ensure that there were Royal Navy resources available in the event of a no-deal Brexit, because it wasn't just symbolic, it was economically vital. And there were all sorts of excuses that were given as to why vessels that were in port shouldn't be deployed in those terms. Just in passing, I should say, that when a Royal Naval vessel was actually dispatched to the Channel Islands at a particular point when Boris was Prime Minister, when the French were doing all sorts of naughty things to our fishing rights, that coincided with Boris and the government being at its most popular. Now, it may be that any military person listening will think, well, that's precisely the problem. You politicians know that when the steel grey of a Royal Naval vessel is cutting through the Channel, or when the Green Army are deployed, that it's automatically a popular and patriotic thing, and we are not going to become adjuncts to your political adventures. I can understand that, but there are times when it's necessary.
Really also interested in what you said about the commercial airlines. I mean, there was that famous event when I think there was a Somalian rapist that was attempted to be deported on a commercial flight out of Heathrow, and the passengers kind of heard that someone was being deported and they took great umbrage and they staged a revolt, and eventually the flight never took off.
Yes.
But later he turned to be a gang rapist who'd raped a teenage girl, almost inevitably. But I can understand that was like obviously that's not ideal if you're the commercial operator.
It may be that I never fly on them again, but I thought, given how Ryanair and Wizz operate, I can't imagine that they would have been too unhappy if they were offered the chance to conduct these flights with a healthy profit to be made. But apparently, again, I'm sure Michael O'Leary will even now ban me from every Ryanair flight. But he's never struck me as someone who is soft-edged. But nevertheless, it was an issue that they were worried that their reputation would suffer, even if it was the case that they were paid handsomely by the taxpayer.
Final question is from John Barnett. Is the UN Security Council now redundant? What purpose will it and the UN in general have in the years ahead?
I don't think it's redundant, but it does face increasing questions. I think that one may laugh at President Trump's creation of, in effect, an alternative UN or alternative UN Security Council with his Board of Peace, with various Central Asian leaders and various mustachioed Middle Eastern potentates all paying £1 billion to join him in this rival League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
They pay £1 billion?
Apparently.
Wow.
But I think that it's still the case that having, through the United Nations, a forum where almost every nation in the world will have diplomatic representatives who meet serves a function, and the Security Council, even though people would argue that Britain and France's membership of it is an overhang from 1945, I still think serves a function.
Sorry, Britain and France is on the Security Council?
Yes, our permanent seats.
Yeah.
I know I'm making a rather limp defence of it, but I think a limp defence is all I can muster.
Yes.
But it's still a defence.
Yes. Well, I mean, actually, in a way, I think it kind of makes sense because you have the sort of the three big aggressive powers of the world, America, Russia, China. But then you have France and Britain that kind of, some people might say it's an imperial hangover, but I also think they have some of the higher military spends and global interests, obviously as kind of post-imperial powers, but they also kind of represent those middling powers in the world. And I think, therefore, it does feel appropriate that you've got someone representing that rather than just the kind of the big guns thrashing it out at all times. The thing about the UN is that I think we have to, by all means, get people together, have them speak, sort of corral people. But there is a way in which it is sometimes spoken of as a kind of infallible body.
Yes.
And I really reject that because obviously, as with everything, it simply reflects the interests of the countries that participate.
Quite.
Some of the countries that participate are what we would consider to be the most morally reprehensible countries in the world. And obviously they have their own national interests at heart. And that's where I think you have to be circumspect and remember that. It's often like, kind of, with the Chagos and that kind of Starmery way of looking at the world, it's like, well, it's just international law. And it's like, well, yes, it is. But who makes those decisions? Which countries are exercising?
Totally.
Do you know what I mean? I think that, we shouldn't object to people discussing, but I don't think we should necessarily take their pronouncements as gospel. National interest ultimately supersedes, and we're really learning this the hard way at the moment, really supersedes the multilateral interest.
Gospel is the right analogy because the UN is sometimes spoken of as though the representatives of nation states, when they are speaking through the UN, have become angelic. That the leader of Equatorial Guinea...
Yeah, or like the Taliban on the women's panel or whatever it is, Yes. Was it Iran or was it Afghanistan that was on the women's body?
Yes, and at different times Syria and Libya have been in charge of disarmament or human rights committees and so on. So, that you have the leader of Equatorial Guinea, so you have a dictator who keeps his enemies in a fridge. And then when he's on the UN Security Council, it is the case that his vote is as valuable as anyone else's in deciding whether or not X or Y is a humanitarian mission that is sanctioned by the UN Charter. They are states with their own interests, their own impulses that will use or abuse international law as it suits them. So as a functional means of states getting together, working out particular propositions, perhaps resolving conflicts between themselves, the UN has a value as an institution. But you are absolutely right that simply because you have a majority for a particular UN proposition, that it achieves this eschatological significance. No.
When I was at school, I remember we learned about the League of Nations for GCSE, and it was all very interesting. And as with all good intentioned schemes, eventually reality will come to mug it, as turned out to be the case. But I remember when we were learning about the League of Nations, it was GCSE, so you often had to do a kind of simple essay that was like saying, was it good, was it bad, pros and cons. And I remember seeing amongst the pros listed was just that it later led to the founding of the UN.
Yes.
And that was so funny to me because it was like, well, that alone should be good enough. But why? I mean, I'm not saying I disagree, but it's just interesting that is being taught as a kind of gospel, that sort of plurilateral bodies are to be welcomed, whatever they do and whatever they're saying.
It's like saying the reason that you should invest in this cow is that you will get a calf one day. Yes, but
but why?
But why haven't I invested in real estate, crypto? The natural, as it happens, British desire, which our education system often encodes, to see both sides of a question before coming down on one side or another in a measured way, does mean that there is a British predisposition sometimes always to see or to attempt to see the virtue in that which has none. And indeed, on the whole, the capacity to judge a case by seeing what the other side thinks before coming to your own conclusion can have value. However, in our diplomats, indeed those who are at the UN, the capacity to see the other side of the case sometimes is much sharper than their ability to understand what Britain's case is. So the whole process by which diplomats, some, operate is to internalise the arguments of the other side. And our colleague William Atkinson touched on this the other week when he made the point that some of those people who'd served in Iran had become so, I hesitate to say seduced, but so convinced by the virtues of what is an amazing country, that they became, in effect, representatives of the Iranian government back to Britain rather than the other way around. And of course, famously, that situation has occurred with Arabists and Sinophiles in the Foreign Office, who find that the culture and the language of the areas to which they're dispatched are so absorbing that they end up almost becoming, well, horrendously old-fashioned phrase, but going native.
Well, it's the modern form of Orientalism.
Exactly.
And actually, the form of Orientalism that people, that like Edward Said objected to, in some cases he was objecting to people that had devoted their lives towards preserving particular language, let's say, or aspects of culture and trying to bring it to the forefront. So it wasn't just cosplay, it was often brought out through deep learning and understanding. But that particular attitude has never gone away. It's still very much present, but probably lacks the learning that it had 150 years ago.
I think that is exactly right. If it's the fruit of deep immersion in that culture and understanding, or at the very least of respectful curiosity, great. But what you sometimes have is trahison d'éclat, whereby those who look at another culture become entranced by it on a superficial but still potentially harmful level. On the United Nations, I think one of the people who we have sent there who, to be fair, never succumbed to that and has been a very successful diplomat is Karen Pierce, who was our ambassador in the US and, of course, our ambassador to the United Nations. She, I think, is a perfect counterexample of how you can be a diplomat who has, in the way in which she articulated, a very clear sense.
The Russians were said to be very scared of her.
No, quite.
You go, Dame Karen.
She's a formidable and intelligent person. And I the reason that I mention it is that there are and have been, including some of our representatives at the UN, people who do have that. And I think also, I don't know him well, but I think that Jeremy Greenstock, when he was there during the Iraq War, I think handled the role skillfully. So I think that the UN Security Council and our representative there can play a role in articulating Britain's worldview at critical moments if you have the right dude in place. And if you'd like to submit a question for Quite Right next week, go to spectator.com/Quite Right and click to submit your question.